No me dice que estaba... So we're going to start in a second. So Mary Calder is going to be chairing the event today. We were always subscribed on the internet, but apparently when the day is a bit too cold to come here, we're going to have a stream. I think there's a live stream somewhere in the internet, but the link they send me, which I share on the website, doesn't really work, although we are being now filmed. So we'll try to turn it into a video and share it later on. Well, I'll just let Mary call to chair the event.
Okay, welcome everybody. Do you all want to come and sit down?
Yeah, why not?
Maybe people thought it was 6:30, like me. So, welcome everybody to this event on social fragmentation in Catalonia. And I will introduce, my name's Mary Caldor, and I run the Civil Society and Conflict Research Unit here at LSE. And I'm going to start with two people who have written a paper together.
Okay, thank you.
So Adolf Tobena and Albert Satura have written a paper together for Policy Network, which is a sort of social democrat network, called Pathways and Legacies of the Secessionist Push in Catalonia. And I don't know which is your Albert.
Adolf.
Your Albert.
And Albert. This is Albert.
And this is Albert. And so, as I understand it, Albert is a statistician and a professor at the University of Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. And Adolf is a neurobiologist, also in Barcelona.
Yeah.
So that's great. So they come from very different fields, but they're writing about secession in Catalonia.
Yeah.
And they're going to, I don't know, how are you going to do the presentation together?
I will start.
You will start.
5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Great. So I will hand over to you, and then I'll introduce you two when I get to you.
Okay.
Great.
So I can start?
Yes.
Jeffrey. Thank you.
Do you have slides?
Yeah.
Because then I might have to move, so I
Yeah.
can see.
Where you want to sit on the bench?
Yeah, I'm going to sit over here.
Okay. There's a third author of this paper for Policy Network that, by the way, the real academic paper appeared last week in Palgrave Communications. You'll find there with all the methods and statistics duly explained, because the Policy Network is an essay for a general audience. And the third author is José María Oller, who is a professor of statistics at the University of Barcelona. And I come from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. So it's a paper written by professors from probably the three most important universities in Catalonia, not only in Barcelona, but in Catalonia. So it's a joint venture. My part, I decided to.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Shall we turn the lights down?
Oh, a little bit, not completely, because I like to see your faces.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. I decided to use this title for my introduction, From Fists to Clashes, the Catalonia Pathway to Social Fracture, because that story started as a feast, as a tremendous feast, but now we've entered into the period of clashes, serious clashes, sometimes not so serious other times. Next, if it comes. Yeah. Catalonia, it's here. It's in this corner of the Iberian Peninsula, for those who don't remember. And it's on the Mediterranean, but across the Pyrenees. The southern part, the Spanish part, has secession troubles, capital Barcelona. But the northern part, which is rather small, capital Perpignan, is quiet and very happy to continue to remain a remote province of France. And I think it's useful to keep this contrast between the two Catalonia.
Comment to the next.
Yeah. So the appearance of a secessionist movement in Catalonia, in the Spanish Catalonia, it was a surprise. It was a tremendous surprise for almost everybody, even for us, Catalan people. And probably the most outstanding facts that were behind the surprise were two. One is the beauty and the magnificence of the demonstrations, of the street demonstrations. The secessionists in Catalonia have organized fantastic, choreographic, beautiful demonstrations that have captivated the entire world for good reasons, because they are very good at that. Probably they are the best, even better than the Koreans. In the second element for the surprise was the rapid escalation of the phenomenon. Because only 10 years ago, 2010, support for secession, red, was below 20%, around 15%. And this, in 2 years, went to 50%. And particularly, the abruptness occurred in 1 year, 2012. In 1 year. And that's an unexplained, a completely unexpected and unexplained phenomenon. And then it receded a little bit, but has been maintaining the support for cessation with minor oscillations at around 40%. So, what I usually call catexit troubles is a unique experiment that has several characteristics, and they are listed here in my view. The first one, it's massive, colorful street demonstrations that they continue when they want to organize them. Second, a disobedient regional government and a disobedient autonomous parliament. It's not my qualifications, it's their qualifications. Even the lawyers who were defending the leaders of the secessionist parties who are now in prison, they were accepting that they were disobeying continuously. So it's not a qualification, see, an acceptation. Okay. Third, a stubborn media propaganda, particularly from the different radios, TVs, channels, social networks, under the control of the regional government. Fourth, constant social and contextual pressure against everybody. 5, 2 illegal pseudo-referendums. They were able to organize 2, not only 1, 2 pseudo-referendums of self-determination, and 5, a proclamation of independence, a fully declaration of independence at the parliament by the president then of Catalonia, that failed. And that has occurred without the support of the social majority of the region. And within a democratic country, inside the European Union, amid a society, a context which is open, tolerant, and advanced, and has produced a divided society. A society that wasn't divided, now it's completely divided, deeply divided. And it's divided on the issue of secession, and the region now is formed by almost a half of secessionists and a bit more than half of unionists. Unionists in Spain and Catalonia is an insult, but this only happens in Catalonia and Spain. In all the world, it's not an insult. That's the reason that we use the name unionist, just for facilitating understanding. So that's the situation. Then the question is, this was a growth-rated phenomenon and a spontaneous phenomenon that was born from who knows the reasons, but essentially from a deep aspiration of the people there, or was an elite-induced secession push and organized from the top. That we are aware that it's the typical question that political scientists have never resolved for any conflict. That's my impression. But we've done research, a longitudinal research on all the data that the official survey agency of the Catalonian government, this is official data, all the data that regularly produces the official agency for surveys of the Catalonian government from 2006 to last July. And Albert Satorra will present the specifics of that. And in that data, we have elements, we have hints that permit to be close to the response of that, But I promised you that I will be brief, and I'm going to finish immediately. So, measuring that the difference between secessionists and unionists, not by surveys, but by electoral results, the difference is 150,000 votes. In the last 2 regional elections, the difference between one part of the region and the other parts, it's only that. I skipped that, and I skipped all that, and I go to here. Okay. In 2014, I wrote an essay advancing my view, because at that time, even before our data, there was enough data on the different distribution of the supporters of a possible secession against the enemies of secession, and the distribution of the majoritarian languages, Spanish versus Catalan, and the segmentations of economic classes. That data was available there, and I advanced that hypothesis. This is because there were an enormous quantity of conjectures about the origins of that. A very special thing that didn't happen in Bavaria, in Wales, in Brittany, in Corsica, in Sicilia, in Catalonia, or in Catalonia, or in Galicia, or in the Canary Islands. It only happened there. So I advanced that. It's an example of a struggle, domestic and nationalistic, but the characteristic that define that struggle, that litigation, is that it goes along an ethnocultural frontier, and particularly along an ethno-linguistic frontier. I was looking for my water, but there is no water, so I have to salivate. Okay. So I skipped all those were previous data to produce that hypothesis. And now, even Mr. Piketty, who is a tremendously respected leftist French economist, in his last book, last week, it seems to me that it hasn't arrived to the bookstores still. He is reproducing what I was saying. The division in Catalonia runs not only on different territorial distribution of people and different linguistic distribution of people, but also on different economic power of people. And the secessionists or the rich, they are rich rebels, whereas the non-secessionists or the poorest classes of Catalonia. And he presents the secessionist movement as a form of fiscal egoism. Another characteristic, a final thing, that is curious, is that secessionists deny. They deny that there is a division continuously, and they put an enormous propaganda to deny that. This is the last survey. You can see that the secessionists, the black in this coloration, this is from a very well-known survey agency in Spain. They say, no, Catalonia is not divided into halves, 43%. But the rest of Catalans, 57%, they say, yes, it's completely divided. So, to finish my part, before all the material that Albert is going to present to you, we conclude in previous work that the secessionists, compared to unionists, are more politically engaged, and they are more passionate, and they are much more determined and convinced of attaining their goals. They have a narrower and a stronger national identification, more homogeneous linguistic habits, and their media consumption preference are highly restricted to the regional bubble. They are more affluent, and their economic perspectives are superior as well. So they pertain to privileged segments of society, and they are much more fanatized. All these conditions predict of the chronification of the challenge. So the secessionist passion is alive, very active within a fractured society. So the conflict is going to continue, and the clashes finally have arrived. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. A very lax chair, because I've allowed the 5 minutes to extend to 20 minutes. And I hope that everybody else won't follow your example, because otherwise there will be no time.
Okay.
So now I hand over to, I hope you can be 10 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks. I will say that there was, for me personally, was very good positive side of this conflict. I ended meeting Adolf, working with him, and the colleagues that have been working on these projects. So I should find my slides. Okay. And I suppose. Okay. So I don't have to. I've been introduced. Well, it's a pleasure, first of all, to, as I said, to work with my colleagues and on that, and thanks to the people who attend about Catalonia, who wants to know about Catalonia, and in this scenario of the LSE, and I thank the organizer for taking us here. So, dimensions. I'm going to go down, to descend to the ground of the data, and exploring dimensions and the persistence along time. And I put a picture. This is a town which I know very much, because it's a town where I had my house from 18th or 17th century house. And these all the flags except one, the Spanish one. And it here says, aquesta bandera andés imposada des de fora.
This flag is imposed one.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah, so in my house, well, in Barcelona, also, there is, yesterday, this Spanish flag, another neighbor, the independentist flag. By the way, the independentist flag was also, this is the Ayuntamiento,
The town
hall. So the independent flag was posted in the Ayuntamiento, but fortunately my camera couldn't download this day. But anyway, and this is the clashes that at the university that I also know a lot, is UPF. People trying to get in, people with masks resisting because the university was closed. So the two, there it is. That didn't happen on the time of the feast.
No.
Okay, I'm going to talk about work which is in this, John Catalonia, and with José María Ollier, which is also the fortunate colleague I got in touch, thanks to the process, in fact. Joining efforts. The paper in Policy Network and the paper in Power Communications of the group Nature that mentioned Adolf. This is what, in open access, this work. We tried to uncover from years ago, uncovering Catalonian divides. Maybe that's my bias for being statistics. I don't believe on the mean. I believe on finding the difference among, and finding the variables that, because it's the way to explain, not to prove causality, which is impossible to prove, but to be able to approach. And we have registered data, and we will concentrate on survey data. I will go register data. This is the first map we call the balcony of Catalonia, where the municipalities on the intensity of the constitutional, there was elaborated an index, and then we see that the intensity of secession falls down and gets against the Catalonian, the towns which are urban. it doesn't get against Madrid, it gets again one part of Catalonia. We fall down, the secessionists. This is aggregated data computed from all the register. But this is explain also that one propaganda of secessionists has been gathering many mayors. The point is that 78% of the mayors accounts for only 25% of the population of Catalonia, while 22% of the municipalities account for 75. So there is a way to sell unanimity, but I'm going to concentrate on the survey data, and the survey data is 45 surveys taken from the source is the Generalitat de Catalunya, is tied to the Ministry of the Presidency. They have a lot of frequent surveys and barometer de opinión pública. And we have 88,000 respondents along the year 2006 to 2019. Secession yes or not, that would be one in 2018, but the point is that this is stability of yes and no, the yes in red, are below the 50% and above 40%. It's stable from 15 to 19. The point is that secession question is asked only since 15. So we wanted to study the evolution before the process started. So we had to search for other variables in the survey. And we found one variable which is sense of belonging. The question being asked, how do you feel? You feel only Catalan, or feel more Catalan than Spanish, or feel equally Catalan and Spanish, or more Spanish, or only Spanish? That is a variable that we see that predicts the vote for independence, and that is available till 2006. That was our variable to get, to use. And then we also speculated, we didn't know, but family mother language. Which language do you speak when you were a child? They responded to that. And that's another variable. And regional media following. Which media do you follow? The regional channels, TV, or radio, or any other? We recorded that. And support of secession, this is the variable that we say. And then the major divide. That was striking to see that family mother language is what we would see. Here it is. You see, we take Catalan citizens, which family mother language is Catalan, they are here, the level of 70-80 on support of secession. If we take those whose mother language, something that you cannot take out of these people because it's like the color of the eyes and is a richness of Catalonia, they appear. Stable on this period of 15 to 19. So let's take the sense of belonging and let's see from before 15. And here it is, the picture. That's a very interesting picture, which is people who have sense of belonging only Catalan is this color. Then it is increased in the period, and especially in 2012 starts an increase. People who are interested in two. The extreme to be only Catalan, to feel only Catalan, and the other to be equally Catalan than Spanish, because that's what we need in the society. People feel Catalan and feel Spanish. We want that. And it was, before was the percentage, was the dominant one. And this descended, it has been erosion. And it has been an increment of what is extreme. Fortunately, there has not been an increase of only Spanish. No. So this is the only two that were interesting. Let's cut by my family mother language. Let's cut by that variable. And here is the impressive graph. This is the most impressive graph I have ever seen in my statistics life. You see, people whose mother language is Catalan, 38.5% is the number that appeared in Adolf, escalated to only Catalan. When 2012 is directing line. And what we most appreciate, probably where we most like the dual erosion. That's for the segment, those Catalan people who only speaks Catalan. Sorry, whose mother language is Catalan. Let's see the others. No move, practically. A slight erosion is 55.6% of the Catalan citizens. They have well, there is some erosion on the dual, so it's a loss. There is some escalation on the only Catalan, but it's minimum and is some kind of saying, there is a kind of immunology to the passing of this phenomenon. So let's see whether there is other variables associated with these changes. And we search for media influence, that variable, whether they watch TV, regional, or radio, or others. And then we combine that, language and media, and we see that Catalan and family mother language Catalan, and I watch regional media, they get this tremendous escalation. And the Spanish also, the Spanish that the people, Catalan citizens whose family mother language is Spanish, they watch TV, they also get escalation. Well, the Spanish that doesn't see the others, and by the way, these are the major groups. And these, in fact, the bands, these are bands, which these are very narrow because these are the highest group, the Spanish mother language, that doesn't watch regional media, but the ones that watch, these are small, and so you can see that it's small because it's more, the band, 95% bound is wider because it fluctuates more, it gets this increase. So, and for the other variable, dual, being Spanish and Catalan, that we also see that there is this descent of the Spanish people with regional, Spanish speaking family speaking, mother family speaking Spanish, that they see the regional media, they get a descent, and there is for the others, there is a stability and also the descent of Catalan family mother language Catalan versus the other. So these are, there is association with the media, and finally, well, here we can get...
Well, it has to be said that regional media only uses Catalan language to complement that.
Yeah.
Okay? So people who follow regional media only listen or watch elements in Catalan language. Okay?
If somebody wants to land in Barcelona and finds a Catalan in the street and wants to see whether the Catalan is secessionist or not, there is a simple model. Ask, well, check whether the mother tongue is Catalan and whether mother tongue Spanish don't watch regional media, and this is the people. The area is the proportion of the share in the population of this group of people, the D. The C, there is mother tongue Spanish, but they watch the media. There is an increase. The mother tongue Catalan and media, there is also an increase. And the mother tongue Catalan and as well and media, then there is. The proportion goes from 60% to 86%.
The increase is support for secession. The increase is support for secession in this graph. Okay?
Yes. Yes, because the proportion, the high, is the probability that they vote for secession, for support of secession. So this, there is in the power graph we show the dynamic graph, the evolution of these A to C groups, how the evolution, and we also always see that there is a fundamental point, 25N, which is the elections in 2012, where the Nationalistic Party adopted the strategy or adhered to the secessionists. That is always in the middle of the oscillation along the years. So,
it's so interesting, but you've already had 20 minutes too.
okay. So let me, okay. In concluding, if you allow me.
He concludes.
Erosion of dual sense of belonging, dramatic increase of strength of sense of belonging for only for the Catalans, modern language. Fortunately, good news with no increase of the sentiment of belonging only Spanish. There is association. Well, it's, I think conclusions, but let me this point to note there is a high percentage of population in Catalonia that speaks modern tongue. Family mother tongue is Spanish. Public media is only in Catalan. Catalan language is mandatory in the school. Myself at the university, I and others, I teach in Catalan. I never had any restrictions on that. Well, with people in course in English, but there is that's something to know. And maybe my personal opinion, if you allow me. This November, a few days ago, receiving the prize Francisco Cercedo in journalism, the Catalan writer Javier Cerca said, in those days of September, miles de catalanes nos hemos sentido solos. We felt alone. And thanks the king for his words, you are not alone. That were addressed in October 3. Yes, that was the case. Some people, we felt, we do not understand how the Generalitat of Catalonia and other public institutions are not neutral on an issue that is so critical for our life and in which Catalan citizens are so divided. And we feel abandoned by the Generalitat, an institution that should represent all the Catalans and that is exerting such a partisan position. That's the view of many Catalans, not of all, but many, among which is this Javier Cercas, myself, and many colleagues. Other reference I put leave here, and that's it.
Okay.
Thanks.
I think we Remainers in Britain understand how you feel about the bias of our institutions. So I'm going to read my little pile of papers. I'm going to ask Caroline to come next. And I'm really sorry that we've gone on, I've allowed everybody to go on too long, but I hope we can stick to 10 minutes.
Yes, I will try my best to stick to 10 minutes.
Let me just tell you, Caroline is lecturer in politics and Spanish at Aston University in Birmingham and co-director of the Aston Centre for Europe. And she specialises in nationalist movements, and she's written a book called Nationalist Politics and Regional Financing System in the Basque Country and Catalonia.
Thank you. Okay, I will try and stick to my 10 minutes. And I feel slightly awkward as a Brit talking to what looks like an audience mainly of Spaniards and Catalans, so I apologise if I've made any mistakes in my understanding of things. I haven't got slides because I'm not a quantitative person. The impressions that I have formed over time are based on a lot of interviews I've conducted over the years in Barcelona and in Madrid with politicians representing the full spectrum of parties, both statewide parties and pro-independence parties, nationalist parties, etc. So, in the graphs that we've just seen, we saw that there was a rapid rise in pro-independence sentiment in Catalonia from around 2010 onwards, but particularly from 2012 onwards. And I'm particularly interested in looking at what ways political competition at both Catalan level and Spanish level have contributed to that. That my fellow panellists were saying before that largely that rise was unexpected, but I think actually if we look at the behaviour of Convergencia, your traditional mainstream nationalist party in Catalonia, there were signs before that that was going to happen. A lot have interpreted Artur Mas's stance when he shifted towards a pro-sovereignty agenda ahead of the 2012 regional elections in Catalonia as being political expediency due to the rise of a grassroots movement. But actually, the party had started talking about the need for a national transition back in 2006-2007. The party was already shifting in that direction back then. So really, if we want to understand why Convergencia shifted to a pro-sovereignty agenda from 2012, we need to look at why they started going in that direction from 2006-2007. And I would say that from that stage, there were really two factors. One was there was genuine conviction within certain sectors of the party that the state of autonomy, Spain's decentralisation model, had reached its limits. And there were a number of very valid reasons for that. But then, on the other hand, there were also factors to do with political competition. Convergencia was in an increasingly difficult political climate in Catalonia, an increasingly competitive political climate, and it therefore needed to adjust. So there were the two factors, genuine conviction that the state of autonomies had reached its limits, but also an increasingly difficult political climate that meant that Convergencia needed to find a way to make sure it would continue to be the dominant party within Catalonia. So if we think about those two factors, first, genuine conviction within sectors of the party that the state of autonomies was reaching its limits. Why was that happening? And really, we can see that from the late 1990s, there was actually a growing sense across a number of parties in Catalonia, not just the nationalist parties, also statewide parties, the socialists and the conservatives as represented in Catalonia. They were also fed up with lack of sufficient infrastructure in Catalonia, with the way the regional financing system was treating Catalonia. There was actually a cross-party concern within Catalonia in the late 1990s about these issues. And actually, ironically, at the time, Convergencia was not the party that started to push most on these issues. It was still in accommodationist mode. If we think back to early 2000s, Convergencia in the Catalan Parliament was still dependent on the Spanish Conservatives for support. It was still trying to find ways to work with Madrid when other actors within Catalonia, most notably the Republican left of Catalonia, but also the Catalan socialists, were starting to push more for a new regional autonomy statute that would address things like the lack of sufficient funding for Catalonia under the way the regional financing system works. And so why did Convergencia then start moving more towards addressing those issues as well? Well, I think really a key turning point, and when I've interviewed members of Convergencia, I mean, obviously it's changed name now, but I'm talking about Convergencia because I'm talking back then. A lot of them have mentioned the fact that, that absolute majority PP Conservative government from 2000 to 2004 was a real turning point for a number of them. But at the same time, there was this issue that new sectors, new generations were coming through in the party. There was a generational shift taking place. We had sectors of the party's youth organisation coming through, as well as sectors, representatives of the Catalan National Federation of students working their ways through the party. And those sectors had always been more pro-sovereignty, more pro-independence-oriented compared to your more traditional members of Convergencia. And if we think, for example, for Artur Mas to turn to a pro-sovereignty stance might have seemed quite surprising. But if we look at someone like his successor, Puigdemont, Puigdemont had never been a party heavyweight within Convergencia, but he had been heavily involved from the 80s within the youth movement of the party, which had always been more pro-sovereignty orientated and against the traditional alliances between Convergencia and the Conservatives. So I think all these factors help to explain why, when Artur Mas, from around 2006 to 2007, started to move the party more towards a pro-sovereignty stance, wanted to lead a sort of a movement towards a national transition, there was genuine conviction within the party that this was needed, that the state of autonomies was coming to an end. So that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, there was also obviously an increasingly competitive political climate, and that also contributed to the direction that the party went in. From the late 1990s, I mean, Convergencia lost its absolute majority in the Catalan Parliament. I think it was 95, it's lost its absolute majority, and it's never had one since. From then on, it had a relative majority. It was facing increasing competition from the Republican left of Catalonia and also from the Catalan socialists, who, especially in the late 1990s, they were moving very much towards more of a Catalanist agenda, supporting some of the same ideas as the more nationalist parties. And this was an increasingly difficult climate for Convergencia to operate in. And it has led, we have seen from then onwards, really, from the early 2000s onwards, that what developed was effectively a form of outbidding competition, as it been called, between Convergencia and particularly the Republican left of Catalonia, mainly between those two parties. And of course, Convergencia was in a very difficult position when it ended up in opposition due to coalition politics at the time when the new Statute of Autonomy was drawn up. And from then on, we have seen this competitive dynamic between Convergencia and Esquerra in particular, which has made it very difficult for either one of them to perhaps take a step back, even if, you know, there might be shifting priorities at different times. It's been very difficult for either of them to do so. And really that mixture of conviction combined with an increasingly competitive environment politically has continued in recent years in the wake of the aftermath of the financial crisis. I mean, obviously, on the one hand, you had, for example, Convergencia being tainted by its implication in corruption scandals. All of that sort of issue contributed to the party needing to develop a new project and pushed it further towards a pro-sovereignty agenda. But at the same time, you had an absolute majority Conservative government in Madrid, which was attempting to re-centralise. For example, a lot of the burden of fiscal adjustment in the wake of the financial crisis was placed on the regions. They had a harder task than the central government did. And so that also gave more reasons for a conviction within sectors of the party that a new relationship with Spain was needed. So really we've seen that mix of the two factors ever since, both conviction within sectors of the party that the state of autonomies is no longer working, but also the need for strategizing in an increasingly competitive environment. And obviously I've only just touched there on behaviour at Catalan regional level in terms of political competition. We've also obviously seen at Spanish national level the way parties have often behaved has also contributed to the rise of a pro-independence movement. I mean, I've looked particularly a lot at regional financing and how that works in Spain, and looking at different periods of negotiation when frequently, you know, both the socialists and the conservatives, their interests lie predominantly in other regions, which therefore means that they look out primarily for those regions. So that sort of dynamic hasn't helped, obviously, to finding an accommodation for Catalonia within Spain. So there's different issues going on, but basically all I wanted to do here was to draw attention to because I think it's often presented, the Catalan situation is, you know, some people see it in a black and white way as a grassroots movement that's pushed the politicians to react. Others see it as an entirely elite-induced movement whereby the parties have shaped the way citizens think about things. I think really it's somewhere in between. There have been a mix of factors going on, and it's not a black and white scenario as to what has led to the rise in the pro-independence movement. Thank you. I hope I didn't go over my 10 minutes.
Now I'm going to... let's go to you. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Yeah. So, you're Jeff.
Yeah, I'm Jeff, yeah.
So now we're going to go to Jeffrey
Miley, yeah.
who's a lecturer in political sociology. Cambridge, and the co-author of Conflict in Catalonia, a Sociological Approximation. So I'm going to be very interested to hear.
Yes, thank you.
analysis.
Yeah, thank you for having me here to speak about this question. I've been talking about Catalan politics, Spanish politics, and Catalan politics for longer than I would have liked to. I wrote my dissertation back in the late 90s, graduated in 2004. So I did my fieldwork in the late 90s when people used to ask, well, why are you talking about Catalonia? There's no problem there. But since then, I've been trying to expand it to work on self-determination movements and comparative perspective, but the Catalan question keeps drawing me back. So anyhow, it's a pleasure to be here. The struggle for self-determination, I think this is a really important issue. That what's going on in Catalonia has to do with a struggle for self-determination. And self-determination is a tricky thing for democratic theory because, as Sir Ivor Jennings put it long ago, it's easy to say, well, let the people decide, but we have to decide who the people are. And so from the standpoint of democratic theory, unless you take a position that nations are somehow given and each nation somehow has a natural right to self-determination, if we throw up what the nation is as a question, it becomes very difficult to deal with, actually. So let's try to get a few approximations about the thorniness of this problem. On the one hand, if we talk about the struggle for self-determination in Catalonia, one thing which is true, which is when we start looking at it as a kind of democratic problem, is in Catalonia there is a supermajority in favor of the idea that whatever you think, yes or no independence, that Catalonia has a right to decide that question unilaterally. That it's up to Catalans to decide whether or not Catalonia should be independent or not. And a lot of the conflict has to do with the way in which the Spanish Constitution doesn't allow for that possibility. So there's this supermajority in Catalan society. It's been asked a few times. It hasn't been asked enough. It would be interesting if we could get this asked more frequently in surveys. But the Centro de Investigaciones Sociológicas stays away from it, and so does the Catalan polling. For most of the time, stays away from it. But when it's been asked, it's been clear that there is a supermajority in favor of this. And it's also clear that at the level of Spain, there's a supermajority that's opposed to this. Okay, and the thing is that the Constitution sort of reflects the will of the Spanish majority and doesn't reflect the will of the Catalan majority on this question. So that's the first issue. So there's a supermajority in favor of a right to self-determination within Catalonia, even though, as we see, when we look at how many people are actually in favor of independence, it goes down. So let's get to the second point, that Catalan society, and this is something that I think our colleagues here, Tobenya and Satorra, have been quite convincing on, Catalan society is quite divided over the question of independence. There's no clear majority in Catalonia, either one way or the other. So some of the data here shows that it looks like it's around 40%, but that's looking at the survey of the overall population. If there were a referendum, it would actually perhaps be very close because those who are in favor of Catalan self-determination and Catalan independence are highly mobilized. And there have been moments at which the anti-independence faction of Catalan society have mobilized. In particular, there was, in the run-up to the referendum, there was a very impressive mass demonstration, though a lot of people came from the rest of Spain. But in general, the Catalan independent side is more mobilized. And so in a referendum, it would have very much to do with the dynamics of who gets the vote out, and it's unclear what would happen. It's unclear what would happen, but it seems clear that there wouldn't be a clear majority either way. So it's a relatively divided society. But then the question is, as the partisans of Catalan independence quickly point out, let us see. And the Spanish Constitution doesn't allow for that possibility. So let me just say a few more things about to add a few more things about the nature of opinions in Catalonia. When we look at this, so I would have to dissent a little bit from, although you guys said some things which are undeniable about the nature of the divide, I would dissent from the idea that Catalonia is a divided society. Because the two polls that you're looking at, there's one poll which feels only Catalan, and then there's another poll that feels Spanish and Catalan. So there's very few people who actually feel only Spanish. And this actually is also reflected when you look at the question of how intensely do you prefer whatever your preference is? How intensely do you prefer independence, or do you prefer not being independent? And what you see is there's an asymmetry between the side which is highly mobilized in favor of independence, which feels very intensely in favor of independence. In fact, we have a survey from 2016 where amongst those who were in favor of independence, a supermajority of those in favor of independence felt on a scale of 1 to 10 between 9 and 10 on how intensely they preferred independence. Whereas when we asked people who preferred staying in Spain, how much did they care about it, a lot of them didn't care that much about it. So you have a very big difference between, let's say, it may be that a majority of the population is against independence, but there is an intense minority which is close to a majority and could be mobilizably a majority, which feels very, very, very fervently in favor of independence. And this, again, is a question from democratic theory, which is an interesting question, which is how to deal with the preference intensity. So if it's true that 40% of the population is in favor of independence and 60% of the population is against independence, but that 40% that's in favor of independence thinks that this is the most important thing in the world, it's not clear, our intuition, about what democracy says. Should an intense minority, should their preferences be catered to more than a more lackadaisical, less intense majority? So I think this is a question. But by all means, the issue is not decided. The rules of the game are stacked against those people who favor intensely independence, because the Spanish Constitution doesn't allow for a referendum to take place. So that's with respect to this question of preference intensity. And so what the Spanish Constitution and what the people on the side of the Spanish Constitution have gone for as the mobilization has occurred is they've gone for a strategy of responding to this mobilization with, rather than accommodating this democratic demand, which is at the level of Catalonia, again and again they win electoral majorities. So democratically elected majorities at the level of Catalonia, the strategy of the Spanish authorities has been to repress, rather than try to accommodate this demand. And so there's a question also from democratic theory, which is how much, if you have at the regional level, you have again and again democratic majorities coming up in favor of something that is not fitting inside of the Constitution. Do we need a new Constitution, or do we repress? And so far, the Spanish authorities have gone for what I would call a rigid understanding of the rule of law, which says we repress this and we put democratically elected politicians in jail for breaking the law. So here we come up to a question which is, we can think of it as democracy versus the rule of law, where the rule of law is imposing over democracy, or we could think of it as, but it's a little bit more difficult than this, perhaps it's a majoritarian understanding of democracy, where the will of the Spanish majority imposes itself over the will of the Catalan majority, or the Catalan intense minority. I think that there's questions with respect to how long you can try to govern through in a democratic context through repression alone. And I think that's part of the question that we have here. Because as well, and this is what I'm most concerned about with respect to the dynamic. On the one hand, there's been a dynamic of polarization that has taken place. Even if I don't agree that we can say that Catalan society is deeply divided, I do think there's definitely been a dynamic of polarization, and two interesting things have happened. One thing is in the Catalan nationalist camp. The Catalan nationalist camp has evolved from something which was a kind of Christian Democrat, relatively conservative, Pujolista kind of convergencia, to now we have a very revolutionary kind of Comités de Defensa de la República in the street. And you've seen as well with Esquerra Republicana taking up much force. So there's been a kind of leftward turn in Catalan nationalism. But it's a leftward turn that comes up against some of the demographic issues that were dealt with, particularly a leftward turn that comes up against a difficulty kind of appealing to, in particular, people from Spanish-speaking working class backgrounds in the metropolitan region of Barcelona. So it's a leftward turn, but nonetheless with a particular demographic difficulty. And that's not for me. I'm a left-wing guy. I kind of think that it's a lot easier to defend Catalan nationalism as it turns to the left than when it was Pujolista. But on the other hand, what you've seen in Spain is we've moved from 15M indignados to the rise of Vox. And the rise of Vox, I think, is only understandable as a reaction to the dynamics in Catalonia. And that is something that is very disturbing to me. And that's a kind of, when we talk about fanaticism, I think that clearly the most obvious culprits of fanaticism are these people that are basically arguing for a resurgence of Spanish fascism, which we clearly see with Vox, which is part and parcel of the dynamics of polarization, and part and parcel of not only the dynamics of polarization, it also has to do with the delegitimation of the establishment parties through corruption that is revealed in the context of austerity politics. So on the one hand, you see Pujolismo goes down, and you see a kind of intensification of a kind of street politics in Catalonia, which veers to the left with some difficulties. But in Spain, you really see a surging Spanish nationalism veering to the far right, and that's very dangerous. And with respect to where we're at a stalemate, really. We're at a stalemate where, on the one hand, as I say, this kind of left-wing turn in Catalan nationalism can't get a supermajority in favor of independence, precisely because it comes up against this thorny difficulty, which is where I have to give you guys, I say you guys are really on to something, which is the difficulty of the Catalan nationalist movement appealing to, in particular, the metropolitan region of Barcelona, that working class Spanish-speaking area. And if there was a way in which they could appeal to those people, then you could see a supermajority emerging in favor of something like this left-wing Catalan nationalist agenda. But they come up against Spanish nationalism in Catalonia. Spanish nationalism in Catalonia. If you look at, for example, the electoral results in the metropolitan area of Barcelona, you see that, in fact, some of these right-wing Spanish forces are much more popular than, let's say, La CUP. The CUP is. So that's the failure of Catalan nationalism and its ability to push for a supermajority in favor of this kind of left-wing independence agenda. But on the other hand, you have a failure of Spanish nationalism because Spain has a real difficult time governing itself right now. And this has to do with some of the dynamics that Carolyn, I think, was talking about the ways in which, for a long time in the 1990s and into the 2000s, in order to govern in Spain, you needed to have support of the Catalan-speaking middle classes that supported Convergencia, which have very much intensified, and that makes it very difficult to govern Spain because this is a sociological base, a very important sociological base for the stability of the post-transition democracy at the level of Spain was some kind of accommodation of the Catalan middle classes. And the Catalan middle classes are being repressed right now rather than being accommodated, and that makes it very difficult to govern Spain in a democratic fashion. Let me just say a couple of things. I think this also speaks again, I'll finish with 2 points. This speaks again to put it in a comparative perspective. This is another manifestation of the ways in which the center and establishment politics have been delegitimated in this period of austerity politics in the post-Eurozone crisis in Europe. And so both the developments in Catalan nationalism and the developments in Spanish nationalism, I think, speak to that. But I think, crucially, what we come to is, and I will appeal to the spirit of the Constitution, we come to a real problem from the standpoint of democratic politics. And here's where I think the spirit of the Constitution comes up against the letter of the Constitution. So the letter of the Constitution says no referendum. But the spirit of the Constitution, if we go back to the time of the transition, was this idea that we have to try to accommodate. We can't just repress. And so at this point, I think there is a real disjuncture between the spirit and the letter of the law. And I think the spirit of the Constitution needs to reign in the end if we're going to have democratic governance in Spain. And I will just refer my Spanish nationalist friends to the Canadian precedent for thinking through things in a more democratic way. Thank you.
And finally, we have Sergi Prado, who is Professor of Comparative Politics at Glasgow University.
Well, hi everybody. Thank you very much for having me here. It is really a great pleasure to be able to share and discuss this with you guys. Well, in the next 45 minutes, I'm going to be talking about... I honestly try to be brief, also being the last one. I would like to hear what everybody has to say. But in any case, I just wanted to highlight a couple of issues. The first one is, who are these secessionist voters, really? I think that this is the very first step in order to understand the motives, the incentives, in order to really sort of like discuss the second aspect of the presentation, which are the different viable ways forward. Yeah? So essentially, I will just start off with some very, very basic descriptive statistics, really, that complement many of the things that have been said, but perhaps provide sort of like a slightly broader sort of like portrait of these canonical secessionist voter, using the second wave of the annual 2019 public opinion barometer from the same source that my colleagues have been using before. So we have spoken relatively little about education, and I think that, well, surprise, surprise, in terms of public opinion, education is actually one of the biggest drivers, one of the biggest predictors of secession, and sometimes in a way that it's perhaps not that intuitive, at least for our international audience today. So here you see very simple descriptive statistics here, looking at the percentage of support for independence across the different educational categories, and you clearly see a linear monotonic pattern that is actually quite well known these days, where secondary school and higher levels, so university degrees, tend to be overrepresented. These categories tend to sort of like support independence beyond the 50% threshold. A different interesting aspect that I wanted to discuss that, to be honest, was surprising to me the first time that I was just sort of like looking at this was age, right? I was also expecting a sort of more bimodal sort of like thing, but it's actually much more cross-cutting than what you would sort of sometimes expect according to the narrative, yeah? So it is true that the most secessionist category is the youngest one, from 18 to 24 years old, and the least secessionist category is the oldest, beyond 64 years old. But it is also quite interesting to see this cross-cutting, very similar level across all these middle-age categories, right on the 50% threshold. Yeah? This is just a very simple descriptive statistic, but I think this has important implications for the schooling, the role of the Catalan schooling aspect that was mentioned before. Yeah? There's a lot of talk about, it's a very sensible hypothesis, like, well, to which extent after the restoration of democracy, these new generations of sort of like children schooled only in Catalan, to which extent that changed their value system, their territorial preferences. Well, if that was, true at face value, we should see a big gap, especially between the third and the fourth cohorts, but we don't. And we actually see that essentially this is actually quite cross-cutting. Then I would like to mention something about the relationship between support for independence and household income measured at the monthly level, yeah? And I was very happy when my colleagues mentioned the Piketty sort of like controversy, and this has also been a big debate in social media recently. So you could argue that it's true that essentially there is a somewhat sort of like linear pattern according to which, right, higher levels of income sort of like tend to be a little bit more secessionist. And many people see here a war between the rich and the poor. And of course, this is just a matter of interpretation, and there's all sorts of ideological biases. I struggle to see a war between the rich and the poor here. I actually see quite a very obvious cross-cutting middle-class support around the middle that actually increases a little bit around here. People that are significantly more well-off, €3,000 per month onwards, but then it decreases again and then it picks up again. Yeah. So once we disaggregate income sort of like categories as much as we can, that linearity of the income spectrum gets broken. So I'm not going to deny that there is a linear relationship between income and support for secession, but it's actually much more cross-cutting and middle upper class than what sometimes this is represented in the public debate. Much more importantly, I think, with all these income, class, occupational, the rich versus the poor, I actually think that it's very important to distinguish our individual level of analysis from the aggregate level of analysis. Yeah? So one thing is to say, you know, higher income people have a higher tendency to be secessionists. Yeah? Nothing against that. So if you go to Catalan society and you pick someone at random and you happen to pick someone very well off, I would put all my money, or I would try to guess, chances are this person is going to be secessionist. Fine. Does this mean that this movement is the movement of the rich? I don't think so, yeah? Because then what we need to look at is at the distribution. This is just simply the density function of how populated these categories are. How many people are there in Catalan society earning more than 4,000 euro a month? Well, essentially nobody, yeah? So sure, they are secessionists, but they are just such a small category. So this simply means that if you pick someone at random from society who's rich is going to be secessionist, but if you go to one of these secessionist demonstrations on the 11th of September, you're not going to see a majority of rich people there. You're just going to see a majority of people from the most populated income categories. Even if individually each category is slightly less likely than the richer ones, they are just conforming the bulk of society. This is the so-called individualistic fallacy that we also make when describing Brexit in the aggregate, no? And so on and so forth. Anyways. Okay, so all this talk about the occupational income sort of like story made me think like, well, perhaps there's a bit of economic preference, ideological driver behind it, no? But because, of course, the demand for more fiscal federalism, control of regional finances is such an important aspect in the, at least the elite sort of like discourse in the secessionist movement. But then I actually don't see much evidence that economic preferences truly correlate with support for secession. So essentially in this survey you see to which extent, so the level of agreement towards this item, which is to which extent government should not intervene in the economy. Yeah? A very classical item in public opinion research to try to infer right-wing or left-wing economic kind of like preferences. And you see that, you know, the level of secessionism between agree, neutral, and disagree is actually kind of the same. So there's not a big economic preference, market versus redistribution divide here. There is a very strong divide when talking about socio-cultural issues. Yeah? The territorial dimension is increasingly overlapping with non-economic socio-cultural kind of attitudes towards issues. And interestingly, and again, sometimes this is actually very well known, I think, and amongst people working with this data, but perhaps a bit more surprising for international analysts and people who do not follow the topic that well, the liberal side is typically correlated with the secessionist side. Yeah? So here to the statement, gay couples should be able to adopt children like heterosexual couples. People very much agreeing or very strongly agreeing with this, meaning the liberal kind of like response to this, is the one that is actually above 50% of support for secession. And if you're a bit more neutral or a bit less into gay rights, you're actually not that secessionist. What happens with immigration attitudes? Yeah, this is actually my main line of research. I'm very interested in sort of like these anti-immigrant attitudes, radical right voting and stuff like this. Agreement or disagreement towards basically this statement. With so much immigration, one doesn't feel like at home anymore. Yeah? So people who disagree or strongly disagree with this statement, so the pro-immigration kind of like bunch in Catalan society is also supporting the 50, secession above the 50% threshold, and the relationship is strong and monotonic, and it resists the typical controls in multivariate analysis, and so on and so forth, right? So this, I think, is some element. This doesn't prove nor disprove anything. This is just a descriptive analysis, but that puts into question the ethnocultural interpretation, I think, of the movement that has been given before. Yeah. So this is a pro-immigration, socially liberal, nationalistic movement, and I understand that the two things are like, what is going on, right? It is actually not. It is actually not so obvious. So this is what I call the secession. Maybe some people call the secessionist paradox. Yeah? This is a nationalistic movement. It is indeed sort of upbringing, language, identity, as my colleagues showed before, I mean, matter a lot. I mean, this is a territorial center-periphery conflict. How would they not? But it's a bit more nuanced than that, yeah? So I think that this is a liberal nationalist movement. And the secessionist paradox is essentially basically this. Why then? The winners of the status quo, we're talking about the highly educated, we're talking about the middle and the middle upper classes, we're talking about people who do not fear globalization, who like it, they like immigration. Why then they want to secede? Yeah? This is a bit the paradox that is food for thought for the discussion. If you ask these people, and I'm aware that this is very controversial, yeah? But if you ask, of course, this group, they're going to talk. I'm surprised we haven't spoken too much about it before. But essentially, the plan A of these people, I think, it was never secession, not in the last decade. We really need to understand what happened in the 2010s, yeah? I think, and actually Caroline, I think, explained that very well, the evolution of the preferences. I think the plan A of these people was to change the constitutional reconfiguration of the state, to have more control of the taxes, to have more recognition in terms of national, cultural, whatever. And then they actually put all the eggs in the basket in the 2010s with the Catalan Statute of Autonomy. That has been perceived by this group, and I'm aware that many people will disagree, and some others will agree, but this has been perceived as a complete failure, as the proof that federalism, that the middle of the road is not possible in Spain. Yeah? Because once again, we're talking about the status quo people, we're talking about the highly educated, we're not talking about the revolutionary container burning sort of like type. Yeah? We're talking about very status quo type. And this is why the Catalan movement, I think, was never explicitly secessionist. The interpretation then of the failure of the federal route in the best possible conditions, with a friendly left-wing government that theoretically was claiming to be federal, and with the secessionists in Catalonia supporting a left-wing coalition rather than supporting a nationalistic front with a traditional Convergencia y Unión center-right. So the classical secessionists supporting a federal center-left agenda with, you know, the socialist government in Spain, that didn't come to fruition. They say, then what else? There's absolutely no chance. This is at least the interpretation, right? So how come these guys who have so much to lose from a change in the status quo still support secession? Because they don't see any clear alternative from the state that is better than that. Yeah? So the costs of secession are still lower than the costs of the status quo. Kind of crazy. They don't perceive any sort of like anything in the last decade, anything that was seemingly attractive. There's also a macro level argument, and I'm towards the end now. There's a macro level argument that applies to Catalonia, but not only, right? There's a bit of an interesting sort of like deepening of regional divides precisely in an era of globalization. Some people find this puzzling, yeah? They say, hey, we're more connected than ever. We're more open than ever. We trade with everybody. Why this retrenchment towards regional sort of like divides? Well, precisely because globalization now has gone so far away. From a political economic perspective, national markets are less meaningful. Yeah? You don't have to trade within your national state anymore. As a firm in Barcelona, you trade with Switzerland, you trade with the UK, you trade with China. In order to get military security, you don't need the national boundaries anymore. No? So precisely globalization has deepened socioeconomic, political inequalities across regions. And the secessionist movement, I believe, sees this as an opportunity. They say, oh, that lowers the cost of secession because now we have a global, supranational European thing. We don't need the national market anymore to survive. We can do it on our own. So this is not the same as populist anti-immigrant movements. This is the mirror image of this. These guys like globalization and they want a seat on the globalization game. They want to be part of it. Okay, last slide really. 3 ways. Having tried to understand a bit who these guys are and some of the issues in their narrative and some of the issues in their ideological kind of like orientation, there's 3 ways forward, and then we need to discuss, and maybe in the Q&A people have better ideas. My conclusion is going to be not very enlightening and very pessimistic. But there's 3 logical ways forward. The first one is considering these under the lenses of criminal law, which is exactly what Jeffrey was explaining. Yeah? Some people would say repressive, some people would say sort of like the legal action. Like, guys, this is an anomalous preference. This preference is actually not quite legal / constitutional / legitimate. It was a crime according to our law. We are a democracy, therefore let's apply the law. This is a bit what's happening. This is the only response currently happening. Many people love it and many people do not love it. Then, what am I going to say? Well, you know, at the very least, you can say that even if you love this approach, it is normatively disputed. Yeah, it is not as clear-cut as, you know, some people want to claim. Why is that? Because while it is true that international sort of like elite and countries have been quite silent and quite sort of like light touch on the issue, which has been a blow for the secessionist strategy. You know, they feel a bit of a cold shoulder from the EU and all that. But when push came to shove, you know, reveal preferences in behavioral economic terms, whenever judiciary bodies at the international level had to really act in terms of implementing European warrants of arrest or extraditing people, they just didn't do it. And I feel that the data points are too big now to brush them under the carpet. I feel that this is actually quite telling that neither Germany, nor the UK, nor Switzerland, nor Belgium have been playing ball with the Spanish state when requested to do so. I think this cannot be brushed under the carpet. This is too big for this to be the only strategy. Not to speak about Amnesty International, United Nations, arbitrary detention group. Anyways, let's assume for a second, and then I'm finishing, that let's assume for a second, it was not 45 minutes, but almost. So let's assume for a second that this is normatively all right. Yeah, let's assume for a second that this is legally speaking by the textbook. Well, now I'm wearing my political science hat, which I feel more comfortable wearing because I'm not an expert in criminal law at all. It's just simply not effective. Yeah? Vox is unleashed, legitimized, the conflict is at its peak. So at least from a public policy perspective, we need to be honest and move on. Federal realm. It failed in the 2010s. This is a natural thing that every good-minded, well-meaning, well-hearted person says, why not we sit down and talk? Well, that's what we did the last decade, and this is why we moved on from that. Low popular support in Spain, tremendous electoral costs, especially for the left. We can talk about this again. And then the referendum of self-determination. I was very happy that Jeffrey was sort of like highlighting the pros, the cons, challenges with democratic theory. I think that's the core of the debate. Very tricky. On the one hand, there's a supermajority. Professor Satora was surprised about those crazy graphs that he was showing. Absolutely true. I was very surprised about this one. This is very difficult to see support for a given option in a socially fragmented society. 75% of people in Catalan society would support a referendum for self-determination. This is very rare to see in this era of social fragmentation, unstable governments, polarization. There is a supermajority for something. The question is whether we like this something and whether it is feasible. And the last slide, and I really mean this, this is the only cross-identity coalition, because I agree with my colleagues at the very beginning in the presentation that we need to, these intermediate identities are crucial. Yeah? This is the only solution that involves that intermediate identity. So if you look at support for a referendum across different identity levels, you reach beyond 50% also for those people that feel as Spanish as Catalan, and of course, as it would be more expected, more Catalan than Spanish, and only Catalan. That is the only cross-identity coalition incorporating this middle category, which is indeed the model category where most people are located. Apologize for missing the time, but thank you very much.
I feel quite guilty because only Caroline and Jeffrey.
The Brits.
I'm from California.
Sorry.
There's levels of missing it, though.
You were stuck there, or
Well, I'm all right here for the time being. I will move because in about 10 minutes, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave for an important anti-Brexit meeting. But I just want, it was really fascinating, and I have just two thoughts I want to throw in, but I'm not going to ask people to answer immediately because I'll open the discussion. I mean, one thought is, and it relates to the referendum, what on earth does sovereignty mean nowadays? And it's the same with Brexit. I go around canvassing, and Brexit's a kind of magic bullet, but nobody actually knows what it means in this interdependent world. We used to think a state meant an army, a currency. Well, we know it means a flag. But what does it mean? It means choosing, you're so embedded in the world, it just means choosing, you know, whether you emphasize, I don't know, France or Spain. In the Brexit case, it's the US, or, you know, I just don't know, and nobody knows what it means. So having a referendum, and which is our experience, the problem is nobody knows what they're voting for, actually. But it creates a kind of deep ideological commitment to something that people think means change, but they don't know what it means. So my question is, what the hell is sovereignty in a globalized era? That's one question. And the second question is, I mean, it's so evident that there's some deep link to austerity and the austerity context. It's just that you see it everywhere. And, you know, one can discuss what, I mean, you're the only person who really mentioned it, that one can discuss what the connections are with austerity. But it also occurs to me, you know, isn't this where the left ought to be talking about opposing austerity as a solution to these problems and these issues? And, you know, are they missing a trick on all of that? And maybe if socialists get together with Podemos, that might make a difference. I don't know. But those were my two thoughts. Well, actually, I had another one about gender, but I won't go into that. But let me open for other people to discuss. And then I'm going to hand over to Jose. Yes.
Yes, I visited Barcelona 7 years ago. And really, I mean, that is the most beautiful city. Not one of the most beautiful cities, the most beautiful city. I think that one reason for that is the only people-centered city I have ever visited. I'm not really know that the road is different from other cities. The part of people walking in the center. Yes, my question is that is it that so beautiful they don't like to be part of Spain, or in other words, what's the root cause of the fact they like to be independent? Thank you.
And Jose?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Thank you very much for all the presentations. I found it very interesting. I have a couple of questions. First for Jeff, because there are two things he mentioned that surprised me a little bit. So you do mention that the independence movement moved towards the left, and nominally it did move towards the left, but from the point of view of the discourse they were holding, there's not a clear move towards the left in the sense that, for example, Esquerra Republicana adopted in that time the discourse of Spain robbed from us, and when they were in government, they were actually quite harsh with austerity as well. So, and also, if you see, I mean, Sergi was very convincing in showing that probably the socio-economic divide is not the most definitory one, probably still the ethno-linguistic could be more predictive. But still you see that it's not the working classes, those that are kind of opposing that, and those that may feel the situation more vulnerable vis-a-vis an eventual change. So if you are working class and there's a dramatic change, it may all go better for the best, but they have less of a safety net than the elites or the middle classes, which could deal with this issue there. So that's why, first thing I was thinking, to what extent do you think this goes beyond the nomina, right? And the second thing is about links a little bit with who you mentioned, Sergi, and you as well, I think implicit in terms of federalism. So I think the idea of federalism has been ruled out very quickly. It's true that they kind of discussed it, but at the time when it was the moment, it was 2010, 2011, it was after the moment of austerity, and it was never presented as a real federal state. What it was presenting was more as a confederation. So let's try to have a situation in which different parts of Spain have different statuses, and they have the ability even to because in the referendum in the Statute of Autonomy was a bit more towards confederalism than federalism. So, and my fear is also that a lot of the people in the nationalist camp, they're not comfortable with the federalism. So that's why also it was never a very credible promise, because the left couldn't get even the support of the nationalists in that sense. I don't think a federal system like the German one or something like that would have been accepted in Catalonia, or at least by the nationalists either. So these are two things I wanted to.
So Albert, let's
Well, I'm not going to answer him.
Oh, okay.
No.
Should we collect more questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Okay, whatever you like.
I wanted to thank three comments that the different speakers have done on that. If you give me permission.
I give you permission,
Okay.
and then I'll give Adam
So,
permission. As long as you don't take...
No. Okay. I wanted to thank Carolina first because he introduced the competition between parties.
Yeah.
And so the other side of the grassroots. I wanted to thank Professor Miley because he reminded to everybody that another president of Catalan secessionism has been Vox, the renaissance of right wing in Spain, a phenomenon that we didn't have for almost 50 years. And I also wanted to thank Sergio because he reminded everybody that this is a movement of educated middle classes, essentially. That, in my view, because they never ask them if they want a referendum of self-determination. That's not the element of the question. They always ask, do you want to decide the future of Catalonia? And inside this, you can put, for your question, all kinds of elements and ingredients.
I mean,
just
on that last point, that's why I included an appeal to people who are interested in doing surveys. That this is the finding that Sergi put up is a really important finding, and they don't ask it enough, and they don't ask it in enough ways. You don't see it enough in the survey.
Exactly.
It's a crucial one.
The one I showed is pretty recent and it's available for everyone.
It's the first one. It's the first time.
Yes, I didn't know that.
Okay, I'm allowing Adolf now.
Our one. It's okay, I can speak, but yeah. It's just a very short question.
Albert,
I'm struggling. You see, I'm not political scientist. I am a statistician. I'm just struggling with the data and all these massive amount of data. And my feeling is that there is very difficult to find something. There is surveys which has many questions, and even they have many questions, people get confused. For example, I think it's false, completely false, that the majority, there is a super majority that wants a referendum. It's false, because it's the way it's being asked. Check the questions, check how they ask, because there is the issue of whether it is a referendum with approval from Madrid, or is a referendum without any conditions. So my issue is that I'm not a political scientist, and I think there is a lot of work to work on designing the survey.
We asked the question, regardless of what you think, on the question of independence, do you think that the decision should belong to the Catalan people alone or to all of Spain? That's the question we asked. And we got a supermajority in favor of the Catalan people alone.
I have a follow-up.
That was 2016.
2016.
Yeah.
Yeah, but why there is no? You see, I have my reservation, say, on the way the questionnaire is made. I used several questions on that survey, but that there is a super majority.
I
And
do
for me,
understand. I do
look,
understand
for
the
me-
concern.
and all-
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I do understand. No, you finish your question.
No, I'm also skeptical on how these things are being asked.
I too was skeptical. I got up in front of the Pompeo Fabra. I said, I don't believe it. I said it in front of 200 people, I don't believe it. I asked it myself, and I got what I got, and so I've come around to Sergi's position by looking at the data.
The
And
thing
that's
is
why I
that
say ask it more.
this supermajority comes from two different types of people. The people who won the referendum, who are really dreaming of it every day, and people who are not their first preference, but they are okay with it.
Yeah.
That's why.
That's right.
That's why you get this supermajority. And that's why once you disaggregate it into what you say, that's why suddenly the things get a bit more wobbly. So that supermajority is first and second preferences for a referendum, I think.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm going to hand over
I'm
to
going to take over
Jose.
as a chair, sorry.
And,
No, we're forced to answer my question.
I agree. But the issue is that it has been said that what does it mean voting for independence? And it means then now we make it even more difficult. What does it mean? The question of whether a referendum.
Well, that's a
you
different
want
issue.
that-
Thank you, man.
Thank you.
thank you all.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you very much.
I'll be
Before
in
you leave,
Barcelona.
before you leave, yes, austerity has a lot to do with the whole thing.
Thank you very much.
Well, we must continue. I tell you what, continue talking about it, and I'll get Jose to report, both on austerity and sovereignty.
You asked me a question. Should I answer your question?
Yeah.
so.
Shall we collect more from the audience?
Yeah, we can go like more from if you want.
Yeah.
Don't be shy. Tony? Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for a fantastic presentation, all the different views. I have a question that it's probably is for Jeff, because I know that I read your paper with great interest, and I know that you emphasize that the fact that what you have is not a symmetrical polarization, but a nationalist camp which have high intensity preference, or show quite an intense preference for the views, and another half that we can simplify it has a lower intensity. How that is possible when 10 years ago there was no such a high intensity for any of the preferences today that are at the source of this bitterness in Catalonia? What happened to that half that was that preference so intensely to feel it intensely? And is anything beyond the economic crisis going backwards? Is any factor that has to do with that? I mean, just not simply austerity, but I know that you mentioned austerity and probably plays an important role, but is there anything else apart from austerity that dates back to the 80s, 90s, and 2000s?
Yeah.
Shall we collect one more and then come on, don't be shy. Back there, no? Yep.
I just want to put the speakers. The idea seems quite assumed by your lectures that the Spanish Constitution actually forbids a referendum on independence. I'm not a legal expert, but I don't think there is any active denial of such. I think it's more like the opinion of a highly politicized constitutional court. Maybe can come up with that result. So I wonder, the question is whether there is actually a debate or a road to follow in order to actually contest that.
Yeah. Okay. Can I answer? Can I answer?
I'm going to let him answer my question.
Okay. So just working backwards, I think a constitution say what constitutional lawyers and constitutional courts say they say. And the Spanish Constitution, Article 2, is pretty clear about the indissoluble unity of Spain. But nonetheless, on the question of whether or not there can be a referendum, I think you're right. I think there is wiggle room. Although ultimately you have to have, it's difficult to change the Constitution to get that possibility for the referendum and the legal independence. But I think we definitely need people to start thinking a little bit flexibly about what the Constitution says. That's why I was suggesting, remember the spirit of the Constitution. The spirit of the Constitution is that we need to accommodate the nationalisms, and we have to make it so that neither Spanish nationalism nor Catalan nationalism get everything that they want. So something like that. So I think we need to move in a flexible interpretation. And there, I think the fact that the judiciary is one of the most conservative segments of Spanish society is a real problem. So I think that what you're calling the politicized judiciary, I think, really does get in the way. It's a politicized judiciary, but it's also a very highly legalistic interpretation of what the Constitution stands for. That cuts against the democracy. With respect to the question of how is it possible that these intense preferences are generated, I think one thing that's really important is that I asked a lot of people a lot of politicians, we asked a lot of politicians back in 2010 how they felt. And back in 2010, Convergencia politicians, there was a generational shift. You could really see that they were very much in favor of independence before. And I think that the public switch over to independence on the part of Convergencia Union has a lot to do with, it's a combination of the sentencia of 2010, and the public shift of Convergencia, and then the regional media. I think they're right about that. So it's a sense that federal route that was tried got smashed down, and their leaders were pushing for independence, and they were hearing the message of independence is the only way. And then there's something endogenous to the mobilization. There's a collective mobilization. There's a sense of it's a very powerful thing, with these millions of people on the street. There's something that happens that takes something that was latent and makes it manifest. And once, as you say, it's like a little bit like a toothpaste thing. Once it goes out, it's hard to get back in. So I think there's something like that. The repression, I think, is from the standpoint of people who really care about the unity of Spain. The repression is the dumbest thing they could have possibly done. Because now you have a whole generation of people who, what they see is that Spain is about smashing grandmas, this kind of thing. It was really stupid, I think. From the standpoint of the longer term viability of recomposing some kind of federal majority. With respect to has the independence movement moved to the left, I think I agree with you that Esquerra Republicana is definitely has said things in favor of austerity, but I do think that there is a partisan politic thing, but there's also a politics of the street. And what you see, for example, with the presence of the CUP in the streets, the presence of the Comité de Defensa República, you see within Catalan nationalism, those kinds of left-wing things are a lot more visible than they ever were before. But I definitely think you're absolutely right. Ultimately, they have a very difficult time selling that left-wing project to the traditional left-wing base, which would be the working class metropolitan region. And there I think what you see is something that is very clear that didn't come up. If you ask people left to right, if you ask this support for independence left to right, you see very clear the farther to the left you are, the more you support independence. So as an identity, a kind of left-wing versus right-wing, it's very clear that the Catalan nationalist cause of independence is something that is most attractive to people who are, the farther to the left you are on the spectrum, the more attractive it is to you. So in that respect, there's been a clear ideological move, which were Convergencia for years. I called it, a center-right coalition, and it's hard to call Catalan nationalism center-right anymore.
Yeah, just a small.
One last thing. I'll finish. What's the root cause? The one thing that we haven't talked about at all, I do think ultimately the generation of Catalan nationalist identity was very much reinforced by Franquist repression. And so this is part of the reason why I say the idea that more repression is going to lead to anything but intensifying sentiment for independence. You wouldn't have such strong Catalan national sentiment if there wasn't a legacy of fascist repression of Catalan identity. And so this is why it seems to me the stupidest thing possible, that the way to deal with middle classes in the streets is to beat them up. Anyhow.
Is it one of the independent countries? Is it the case Catalan was independent country or not? Historically.
Well, there was never Catalonia, but there was the Crown of Aragon that had some kind of independence.
Okay.
Just one comment, because it's saying right, left wing is pro-independentist. Left. I think it's a confusion of what is right and left. You see, Esquerra Republicana has the name Esquerra, but it's not a left party. I know people who were in this Comité de Defensa República, which they voted Convergencia, Catalonia. and which are retired people that they have been in contact
But
with
if you ask
Catalonia.
them,
We know these people, so it's confusion, and then the either repression associated with Franco, that is building up this kind of cloud, which is masquerading, I think, the real issue here, which is some educated middle-class people that they decided on 2012, on the 12th to shift to independentists. And they were, in fact, the Conservative Party, Convergencia Democrática.
Well,
I just get lost on the definitions of
on
left and right then.
On the issue, when I mean, I'm Democrat enough to believe that if you ask someone on a scale of 1 to 10, left to right, how do you identify, that I listen to them. If they identify on the left, I say, well, these must be people whose identity is left-wing. And then furthermore, if you ask the kinds of questions that Sergei's looking at, things that we generally think is a liberal thing, it's relatively clear.
Caroline asked me to say something.
Yeah.
I'll go back to you.
Well, I was actually going to answer on a different thing, so I'll shift away, so we'll move away from the polemic a bit. I wanted to go back to the question that Mary raised before about austerity and what the link is to austerity. I mean, personally, I feel that that the financial crisis has not caused the Catalan independence movement, but it has accelerated it. The origins stem from before that, but it has accelerated it. But I think one of the things that I find most interesting in looking at it as an outsider is that, you know, in the wake of the financial crisis, it was the EU that was imposing on Eurozone countries cuts, basically. It was the EU that was telling Spain, you must rein, it was the EU first and foremost that was telling the Spanish central government, you must rein in regional government budgets, because it was the regional debt that was ballooning far faster than the central government debt. Now, the reaction from Catalonia was first and foremost to blame Spain rather than blaming the EU. And that's understandable in the sense that when the Spanish central government decided how to divide up the amount of deficit allowed, they shifted most of the burden of fiscal adjustment onto the regions, and the regions therefore had to, which are the responsible for the things which are most hardest to cut, like health, education, social services. They're the difficult things to cut. They had to make more of an adjustment. But I think it's interesting that. Therefore, it's understandable that the reaction from regional governments was to blame the central government, including the Catalan regional government blaming the central government. But I do find it interesting that it didn't inspire more of a reaction against the EU as well, because it was actually the EU. I looked into this quite in depth, and there were EU authorities telling Spain, central government, you must rein in regional government budgets. So it's an interesting kind of. Dilemma that emerged. That was just something I wanted to raise on the subject of austerity.
Yeah, thank you. Just picking up on a couple of questions, if I may. I thought the question on the constitutional argument was very relevant. Yeah. So I think that on the one hand, the question pointed out to a grey area, which is actually very very interesting. So on the one hand, it's not illegal to organize a referendum, but then the second article of the Constitution makes it illegal to break the nation, right? So there's a bit of a grey area there. And this is why some legal experts were like, well, then why are we jailing elected officials for 13 years if the sentence itself acknowledges that they actually were not after breaking the nation? That was just a mechanism of pressure to sit down and negotiate, right? This is what the sentence says. And this is why this is generating a lot of legal controversy, and perhaps legal experts can help us here. What I can say, though, is that I never fully followed, and I tried, the constitutional argument as such. Like, look, this is not possible because the Constitution does not allow it. This is, while I understand the logic of this, when looking at comparable cases, the Canadian case and the Scottish case, those things were not allowed, and there is a point in which they are allowed if there is political agreement and consensus. So from a liberal democratic perspective, constitutional arrangements reflect new discussions rather than prevent them, right? So this is why I never fully understood this constitutional sort of like argument. And then the classical, I guess, argument is like, well, constitutionally, for example, the UK is different, right? Because it's a bit more multinational. Well, was it? I don't know. I remember in the 60s and 70s how the UK treated the Northern Irish context. Yeah. Was that a multinational way to treat, I don't know. However, at some point, at some point there was a political process with international mediation that said, guys, we actually need to change it. And what was the one thing that truly changed and brought down the conflict? The right of self-determination. Because after all, the Good Friday Agreement is this. It's saying, guys, you are a community, you need power sharing arrangements, and if at some point there's an indication that the shift in public opinion changes, you guys need to do a referendum. This is what the Good Friday Agreement is about. This is how the conflict came to an end. For now, yeah, in a very precarious environment. I have other answers. Do I have time to pick up on
the federalism?
The federalism. I thought that is exactly what I wanted to talk about. I thought it was a very important question. And I think you're right. So federalism is two things, I think, from a political science perspective. Self-rule, meaning regions want more stuff for them, more resources, they want to control their hospitals, their prisons, they want their taxes. But true federalism is also shared rule, which is what you were referring to. A Bundesrat or a Senate in the US, yeah? So suddenly regions shape national legislation. It's true, I think, what you're saying, that the nationalists or the pro-sovereignty Catalan project focus more on self-rule than on shared rule, yeah? And I think that's true. The self-rule aspect in terms of collecting taxes and everything that was suggested the last decade was not even close to what the Basques and Navarrans have now. This is why, from the perspective of the movement, it's like, guys, we're asking something that is not even that revolutionary. We are already applying this within Spain. We would like the same. And then the response was like, no, sorry, you can't. So this is why the grievance or whatever was interpreted in this way. My worry, though, is not so much how the pro-sovereignty movement, how the sovereignty movement considers federalism. I actually think that at the moment that ship has sailed. But my question is anybody really in the Spanish political spectrum amongst the Spanish elites truly federalist? And I actually think that sometimes we misunderstand what federalism means. Federalism means that regional inequalities will exacerbate. This is what federalism is. This means that the rich regions will collect more of their taxes, they will have more power, and there's going to be less inter-regional redistribution. This is what true federalism is. And I think that the word sounds very nice, but once we actually put on paper what it means, then I don't think that the median Spanish voter or any political party is ready to assume that electoral cost.
Yeah, Bob? Yes. One point, very brief. Catalonia is a rich and advanced society. And the majoritarian class, I'm convinced that you will agree with me completely, is mainly conservative on economic options, but wildly, glamorously left on attitudes. And it's a combination of that. Second is a desire. The desire. Give the British people as many referendums as they want. That's sophisticated referendums. And give Catalan people as many referendums as they want, and the Spanish people as well. And the third, always remind and have in mind taxes. On those questions, it's always necessary to think in taxes. Texas has recognized in the Constitution of the United States the possibility to ask for living. And there have been secessionist parties always in Texas. They've never opted for that. But then there is this sophistication that the union will decide also. Okay?
Yeah, I would want to pick up on the question raised by Tony on Jeffrey. In fact, what he said, what make, because what we really need to understand is what has, you see, we had a period in Catalonia that you had people who were independentists, but they never thought on, there was not an action on that. And Esquerra Republicana was very independentist, and Convergencia was just, he didn't believe on that. And suddenly, at a certain point, in 2012, the elections of 25N, which appears on our graphs always as a dividing point on the dynamic multidimensional graph, that's the dividing point for the Catalan people, especially for those who, well, for the family, the Catalan people whose family language is Catalan, and that's watch TV. And radio. So we, in fact, what we aim at is to understand whether there was something beyond left and right and so on who could have initiated the trouble and the conflict at the high tension we have now. And my question is, would that be possible, or we would be on that tension if Generalitat de Catalonia, the government had the majority, has government by the independentists, whether the Generalitat de Catalonia would have been neutral in this point, which is what makes the people who is silent, who demonstrated and not. And you can say that most came from outside, and that's not true. Many people, well, we were there. The issue is, there is one part of Catalonia, the citizens, who make a lot of noise. And they are polarized at the top, and you say, well, maybe even if there is 30% very polarized, that may have more power, and democracy can be argued. You see, this kind of make myself worried about the sense of the democracy, because you have to counter this part of Catalan citizens. They have been silent not because they are not caring about that. They are educated or not. They don't have the government taking partisanship on that issue. And I think
the Spanish government. They got the Spanish government.
No, because we have the status quo.
Can I just...
You see, the Catalan government is partisan, yes or not? Everybody,
so is the Spanish government. The Spanish government has been partisan too the whole time. I mean, both sides have a government that is partisan in their favor.
But the Catalan government is a government for all the Catalans, not only for that minority.
The Spanish government is the government for all the Spaniards.
Can I just...
So, but maybe the issue, the issue we came is what is the role of the Catalan Generalitat. The Catalan Generalitat has been elected under the laws, which is the constitution.
Albert, a couple more questions, and then because we're going to have...
I was wondering if shouldn't this silence people from Catalonia, as you say there's so many, if they want representation, shouldn't they vote for their parties?
So, could you repeat the question again?
Yes, so these silent people in Catalonia, if they want representation in parliament, so the Generalitat is not so biased, let's say, shouldn't these silent people vote, if there's so many, vote for their parties to balance the Generalitat? Just wondering.
Well, this is what they are now going to do. Because they were, you see...
I can see this happening in the elections, though.
No, maybe there is one issue which was reflected on the data of elections, that during some period the Catalans whose family mother language was Spanish, they were having less participation to the autonomous elections, and there was a big shift, and that shift has now diminished. And you see, the part of Catalonia has always been having an independentist Generalitat, because there was a high extension in the site in the urban area, which is in fact the leftist part of Catalonia, because of the workers.
I think it's more complicated than that. I think a lot of people are Spanish-speaking, working class people in Catalonia that are not in favor of independence. They also realize that Spanish nationalism has a really ugly past. They see the rise of things like Vox, and they don't want to be identified with that either.
Yeah.
And they kind of feel caught between two waves.
But Vox is just to recent
years. But Spanish nationalism is not just a recent thing. And so I think a lot of these people that are not in favor of independence don't buy into the independentist story. They also don't buy into the Spanish right story about their fate. I think it's more complicated.
Caroline wants to say something else? Yeah.
No, I was just going to go back to the point about shared rule that Sergey was talking about. And to be honest, I think looking at it from the perspective as an outsider, what you see is that there have been, when I'm talking to students about, how Spanish politics works, one of the first things I mention is how often there have been minority governments in Spain that have worked, because this is just something that, to an outsider, is absolutely unbelievable. And so you have at times when you've had your Basque and Catalan nationalist parties having huge amounts of influence over central government, and other times when they have absolutely no influence whatsoever. And there is no institutionalized mechanism to ensure that there is some form of shared power that withstands the political vagaries of the moment. And that is the problem. I mean, even if we look at, the Basque Economic Agreement, the Concierto Económico, which people have different views about, one of the reasons that the Basque nationalists like that so much is that there is a veto on both sides. The Spanish government cannot take any decision to change that legislation without the Basque government being in agreement. There is a mutual veto, and it needs both sides to be. That's where there is a form of power sharing, but even then it doesn't fully work, because ultimately the Basque nationalists government only ever gets the versions of the figures that it wants at a time when the Spanish central government needs the PNV's support. So even then, the one form of institution that does have a form of mutual veto from both sides, a true power sharing in certain senses, ultimately ends up subject to the political vagaries of the moment. So I think that's, looking at it from an outsider's perspective, that the problem is that and this goes back to what Mary was saying about what is sovereignty in this day and age. And again, I think you learn a lot from speaking to Basque nationalists who are now no longer seeking independence as such. I'm talking about more like the PNV. And they say, well, what does independence mean nowadays? But we do want some sort of equal standing with the Spanish government. So it's more about having some way of institutionalizing things so that it's not subject to the political vagaries of the moment, is my understanding of it.
Can I just let's just say something about this issue of the Catalan, the general...
Can you say something? I think we're going to go, if we have not gone on offline. So, because formally I think they stopped streaming at 8, and but at some point they will kick us out, but I mean, if you want, if you're happy to people discussing
on this issue about the Generalitat not being neutral, I mean, the reality is that the deal at the time of the transition to democracy was that you get autonomy, and in your autonomous institutions, if you can win majorities, you do with your autonomous institutions what you want. And the reality is that again and again and again, Catalan nationalists have won the autonomous elections, and that's why the Catalan nationalists forces that are in power, they push for whatever project they're pushing for. And in 2012, they won a majority on a platform that said we want independence. And so the reality is that's the reality.
That's an interpretation of the reality. And there is other Catalans there.
There are other Catalans, but that's how majority. That's how democracy works.
That's the majority of the parliament. But the majority of the parliament changing the country. That's confusion. That's why.
That's what democracy is. It's a majority in the parliament.
Well, my colleague is another.
Order. We miss you.
Can I clarify?
Say if you wanted to say something.
Okay. Yeah, very brief. Just to touch upon this and to push back a bit on this idea that the Generalitat or the Catalan Parliament is not representative. I actually think that, first of all, the electoral rule that is used in the Catalan Parliament is the same as the Spanish electoral rule, and the districts in Catalonia are bigger, which means that they generate more fragmented, more proportional outcomes. It's very easy for a new party to get into the Catalan Parliament. It's easier than in other regional parliaments. And then why is there a constant majority, parliamentary majority of nationalist forces? And that speaks to who these non-independentists are, and you have it in your graph. So it is correct to say that there's not a majority for independence in Catalonia. Let's say there's a 52, 55, 58, I don't know, % of people who don't say, I want independence. But once you unpack them, these people are very different. So some of these people want hardline re-centralization, a minority of them. Some of them want status quo. Some of them want decentralization. And a minority of them want referendum, but they are not independentists. So the fallacy of the silent majority, it is something that I just don't quite understand. Those people have a free and fair vote like everybody else, and if they don't build the majority, it's because they don't have the numbers.
You have to wait. You have to wait because they are mobilized thanks to the process. Because
just to clarify and give more data, which is very easy. On the last regional elections, the unionists won the elections. Yeah? You were asking that. They won the elections. The first party, by far, they got the first position. But not the majority, okay? But not the majority.
What matters is the government.
That second thing.
That's not how parliamentary democracy.
No.
Parliamentary democracy.
Let me finish. Now, of course, that's elementary. Nobody discusses that. Just is to give data because somebody asked it. And these people never mobilized, they mobilized. And they were the first. Second, the only region in Spain that hasn't changed the electoral systems in order to create a more representative map of the population of the region is Catalonia. All the other regions have changed the electoral law, but Catalonia has decided to use the same that Spain uses in order to give much more representation to the non-populated inland, previously during the 20th century and 19th century, the more right-wing, Catholic, ultra-Catholic and ultra-Orthodox people. That's the situation. To give you the map.
The rural overrepresentation. I think that's true, but I mean, it's hardly something that is. Well, first of all, it happens at the level of all of Spain, and it happens certainly in the United States, where you look at the Senate, the kind of overrepresentation of rural areas. It's quite normal in representative democracies that you have an overrepresentation of rural areas. You can argue for a change, but it's difficult to get that change because the status quo is what it is.
The strange thing is the other regions need that.
But the crucial point is, and I think here I agree with Sergi entirely, if there was a silent majority that really felt strongly along the lines that we have been totally silenced here, it would manifest itself differently. I think what happens is that the people who are not in favor of independence, they feel a variety of different things.
It's like,
but
I agree.
So maybe it's not a silent majority, it's a not coordinated group of.
That's right. It's not coordinated, and it's also different kinds of sentiments towards Spanish nationalism, towards the left-right cleavage, and what you have is an intense preference of a group of people that are unified, and then you have a bunch of other people who also. So can fragment.
We need to finish.
Let me give you another data.
Very short.
Just another data. Yeah. I introduced at the start the example of French Catalonia, because the comparison is always important. Paris is very far, but Madrid is farther to the corners of Spain than Paris in France. And compared, for example, to London is almost at walking distance to everybody in the British Islands. Madrid is like Moscow. So the Spain's government is very far to the interest of the people, and the regional powers have attained a tremendous amount of really power to intervene in the ordinary life of everybody, not only Catalonia, everywhere.
Can I finish with that provocative question? Because you mentioned unless somebody else has something. You mentioned Northern Ireland earlier, and you said like somehow this kind of cleavage society, in a sense, have managed to reach some sort of agreement, stability, by creating this kind of stalemate in which both sides have a capacity to be to each other, and being forced to be both represented in different institutions across the region or the nation. Do you think that is a chance? I mean, I'm not saying this is a central scenario or anything. Do you think there's a chance to design some sort of arrangement? I mean, we see that they are not symmetric sites. So there's some sites that have been now clustered somehow according to a clear idea, a clear plan, while the other part has been idle, probably, or not so concerned for a moment. But is there a way you see that some arrangement could be introduced in order to make both sides to feel somehow more compelled to work together or to force to be together? Or whether this is something desirable or not, or whether this is something else to do?
No, I think that's a good point. So my example of Northern Ireland was just to illustrate that very hardline approaches of a central government to a territorial conflict can change over time, and that there's nothing in the British DNA that is more multinational, multicultural, and that even such a hard, such a brutal conflict like the Northern Irish one can change with political will, despite what the law says. This was my only point. Apart from that, the comparisons between Northern Ireland and Catalonia are actually scarce, I would say, and I wouldn't like to go beyond that comparison. Why is that? Well, I actually think that going back to the ethno-nationalist kind of like adjective, I think that Northern Ireland approaches that a bit more. Yeah? So either you are on one camp or you are in the other. That is a divided society. You cannot jump from a Protestant unionist to a Catholic Republican by sort of like over the course of your life. This is going to be determined by your community, by your family. That is an ethno-nationalist.
But no one feels Catholic and Protestant.
But there are degrees.
Always. There are degrees. Always. But the Catalan, this image of the Catalan society being so divided and all of this, I understand where you guys are going with that, and I agree with the role of identity and language and all of this. But those identities are more malleable. This is what you show. This is what you show. You showed that over the last decade, many people who felt a little bit in between jumped to the Catalan, and there is a bit of fluctuation. That is, by definition, not an ethno-nationalist conflict. Those identities are more malleable, and as I tried to illustrate before, these only Catalan people who are they are not the typical essentialist exclusive identity people because of their levels of education, their income, and their social cultural values. They might be nationalists, but not that exclusive identity.
So you think they could at some point embrace back or accept overlapping identity and jump back into a common project, or do you think that's not?
I mean, I think the issue. It seems pretty clear that there's not a majority in favor of independence. So why is everyone so afraid of a referendum? A referendum is a way to get a majority.
Because we have two examples of a referendum. But one issue, I would dispute.
The Scottish referendum is a good example.
Nobody complains about that one.
Yes.
Yeah.
What you say that there is a leakage from one side to the other, that was not so. Don't get confused with the data. The data is very clear that there is a big difference. Of course there is a leakage, and especially with the media. Full stop. That's what he's saying, and that's what we showed is a clear division there. And if I go to my town, I see that I could put a line, and the independentists are on the single houses in the organizaciones, the left wing. Yes, the left wing, and others are in the That's the difference. And that's what I say, that these measures of left and right wing, I think have to be somewhat revised. We can make a collaboration with that.
I'm going to close the session here, but Adolf has said that he has some small thing to give hope, some positive outlook. So yeah, because it's a positive one, I'm going to give him.
I want to give you all hope on that because I'm always an optimistic, a bit illusory man.